the rate, this increase. You know, again, if it continues to increase the way it has, the chances are not good for black children being born in America today. Now, I want to mention one other technology besides pharmaceuticals where race is a critical factor, and that is the use of these same technologies to test for genotypes in the criminal law context. And the federal government has developed the combined DNA index system, which collects and charts DNA of felons in this country, and states have access to it. So this is the national DNA database. And it is now the largest in the world. Great Britain used to have the largest in the world. The United States, just like we have the highest incarceration rate in the world, we also have the biggest DNA data bank in the world. As I mentioned, Congress recently approved federal agents to collect DNA from anyone they arrest or detain. Originally, the collection of DNA was on sex offenders. It then expanded to felons, and it is now expanding to people who are arrested. These are people who have not been convicted of a crime. They have just been arrested. And in the case of illegal immigrants detained by the government. 47 states, or virtually all states, now collect from all convicted felons, 15 from anyone arrested. That's, you know, a growing number. And 35 states collect from minors convicted of crimes, and in some states, minors who are arrested. I mean, just think a minute what that means for the collection of DNA in black communities. Minor, I doubt that any black person here in this room does not know of a minor who has been arrested, a black minor who's been arrested. I think it's extremely common. Especially, you know, go to some neighborhoods in Chicago and ask teenagers if they've been arrested, and you'll find that most have been. And this is just, the New York Times provided this map, but the one all the way at the end is the number of states where some juveniles have their DNA collected. Okay, so whose DNA? I already suggested this. In Great Britain, the experience with collecting DNA is that huge numbers of black people in the country have had their DNA collected by the police. And some have estimated that currently 40% of all the samples in CODIS are from African Americans. But again, as states continue to collect from people who are just arrested, and more states add that legislation, we'll find larger numbers. And CODIS is the federal one. It also, you know, this congressional permission to collect from people who are just arrested just started. So it can expand to more than 40%. I would predict that very soon most of the DNA in the federal and state databases will be of African Americans. Oops, sorry, the wrong way. Just to give an example of how biased this collection is, in New York City, you know, all the studies show that whites in New York City, white use of marijuana is higher in New York City than black use of marijuana. But the New York City Police Department has been making huge numbers of drug arrests, many of them just stopping people on the street and asking them to show what's in their pocket and arresting them for possession of marijuana. 80% of those who are stopped for possession of marijuana and arrested for possession of marijuana are black and Latino kids. This is, huge numbers with I just don't see how you could justify the racial bias in these arrests. You could make arguments about dangerous neighborhoods and all this, but marijuana arrests, there is no legitimate basis for the gap in arrests between blacks and whites in New York City. Also, in some schools, half of black teenage boys have been arrested. I'm sorry, the wrong way again. And just some statistics on juvenile arrests and incarceration, again, way out of proportion. And so my point here is that even though there have been exonerations of people who are wrongfully convicted, my school has the Center on Wrongful Convictions. I think it's great that so many people who are wrongfully convicted have been set free from death row. But on the other hand, we have to remember that these databases are also used to for purposes of implicating people in crimes and convicting people for crimes. And that's fine, but it shouldn't be on such a racially biased basis. One question I ask is, if you think it's fair to collect the DNA of potentially half the teenage, boys in a city, are you willing to have a universal DNA collection process in the United States? Because that's the only way it would be just to me. If everyone in the United States had their DNA collected and put in the database. And most people say, oh no, that would be a civil liberties violation. Well, why isn't it a civil liberties violation then to collect it from youth on mere charges because the police decided to stop them when we know it's so racially biased? And as I mentioned, this company, DNA Print Genomics, claims to be able to tell the racial makeup, the racial identification of a suspect based on a DNA crime sample. Okay, now I should probably check, how are we doing in terms of time? Okay. Now, how are people in the US who are policymakers, political commentators, political activists, how are they viewing these developments? This increase in race-based science, race-based biotechnology, at the same time that we're seeing very race-conscious punitive governance in this country. When I started this project, I had the misimpression that black people I interviewed would say, this is dangerous, this is terrible, we shouldn't link genetics to race. Well, instead, I found just as many people who said, well, of course race is based in genetics. Of course we're different. And also discovered that the reason for this expansion is partly due to the efforts of blacks and other people of color who have advocated for inclusion in scientific research on the basis of racial difference. Stephen Epstein, who will soon be a professor at Northwestern, we just hired him recently, has a book called Inclusion, and he argues that over the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, black and other activists promoted this paradigm of inclusion and difference. Because we had been excluded, blacks had been excluded, and women also, excluded from clinical trials. It's not to say that black people were excluded from scientific research, because we know of the syphilis experiment, so-called study, experiments on black women during slavery. I mean, all just centuries of very brutal experimentation on black bodies for science. but from the more controlled and benign kinds of clinical trials, helpful clinical trials, to produce pharmaceuticals in more legitimate ways, blacks and women have been excluded. And so they argued for inclusion before Congress based on a paradigm of difference. In other words, we're different, and so therefore it's important to include us in clinical trials. And so we saw a shift from viewing participation in science as something dangerous to demanding inclusion as a way of promoting civil rights. Now, I think an example of that paradigm is the support that the NAACP, the Black Cardiologists, the National Medical Association, and other black groups gave for BiDil. Donna Christensen testified before the Food and Drug Administration that they should approve BiDil as a race-specific drug as a way of remedying medical wrongs against African Americans for whom treatment has been denied and deferred for 400 years. Gary Puckrine, the executive director of the National Minority Health Month Foundation, also a very vocal supporter of BiDil and further race-specific research, creation of pharmaceuticals. He acknowledges that there is a concern about the validity of race, but that we are in this urgent situation where blacks are dying at greater numbers of various diseases, and so it's important to look for special medications for blacks. And as I mentioned, the NAACP also supported BiDil and entered into a contract with Nitromed to help promote BiDil in the black community. And many members of the Black Cardiologists Association also were involved in the clinical trial and in further research on why BiDil works so effectively on African Americans. In addition, I think we're seeing a shift in the idea of civil rights in this genomic era. I thought it was interesting that GINA, the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, that prevents health insurers and employers from discriminating against people on the basis of genetic information, was described as the first civil rights act of the 21st century. And the head of the Personalized Medicine Coalition described it not as a way to protect people's civil liberties or people's interests against discrimination, but as a way to remove barriers to the advancement of personalized medicine. In other words, the reason why this law was so important is because it makes people willing to submit their genetic information to scientists for study. The fear is that if people were afraid they'd be discriminated against, they wouldn't participate in scientific studies, like the New Gene Project at Northwestern that's collecting genetic information on every patient there who consents and linking it de-identified to their medical records. If people are afraid that that information could be used against them, they will not agree to submit their genetic information. And so I think we're seeing a new kind of idea of civil rights, biocitizenship, that revolves around individuals' ability to control their own health information, their own DNA, but it's on a very individualized level. This is a very different kind of civil rights action or bill than the kind of civil rights work of the 60s that was designed to change social institutions, to incorporate social justice into the fabric of America. It's now, how do I have control over my own information? And how can I get medicine that will be geared to my own individual genotype. At the same time, another part of this political context is the promotion of colorblind social policy. And the US Supreme Court, at least as it stands today, has adopted a position of colorblindness, that the government should not take account of race, even in an effort to undo racial injustice in this country. And in 2007, in a very important case, a majority of justices struck down voluntary efforts by 2 school districts to desegregate their schools. Of course, to do that, they had to take race into account. The US Supreme Court held that was unconstitutional. The government could not take race into account, even in an effort to make schools more equal. And Justice Roberts, Chief Justice Roberts, stated, the way to stop discrimination on the basis of race is to stop discriminating on the basis of race. In other words, don't pay attention to race. That's the way to end racial injustice in this country. Of course, you could only believe that if you don't think that there are embedded systems that are unjust that need to be changed. But that is the viewpoint. Racial discrimination was ended during the civil rights era, and we don't need to pay attention to race anymore in social policy. And so I think we're seeing an increase in race consciousness at the molecular level, this expansion of interest in race as a biological trait at the genetic level, at the same time that officials, many officials, including the US Supreme Court, are arguing that race is less important in society and we should take less account of it in society. There are some commentators who have explicitly said this. Jonathan Entine, a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, who wrote Taboo: Why Black Athletes Dominate Sports and Why We're Afraid to Talk About It, arguing that blacks dominate sports because of genetic reasons. And he argues that cultural diversity, all of that is not really important. What's important are very real differences at the biological level, which can have huge consequences in everything from sports performance to success in the classroom. And you can guess who are the people who are good in the classroom and who are the people he thinks are good at sports. Basically already wrote a book about it. His colleague, Sally Satel at the American Enterprise Institute, who wrote this very prominent article, I Am a Racially Profiling Doctor, where she argues that in practicing medicine, she's not colorblind. She always takes account of the patient's race. Stereotyping works because disease isn't colorblind. She advocates colorblindness in social policy explicitly, but you can't be colorblind in biology or medicine because that's where racial difference is, at the genetic level, not in society where everybody's treated equally, but only at the genetic level. And so she says that's why she supports BIDL, because social race is just a construction. It's not important. We make that up, but it's real in biology. It's real in genetics. And so we need medicines that take race into account, but we don't need affirmative action that takes race into account. She also wrote a book called The Health Disparities Myth, where she argued it's a myth that people are treated differently by the medical establishment based on race. And so what these commentators, and I think others, maybe not as explicitly, are saying and putting into their work is that racial differences are real at the molecular level, but merely constructed in society, turning on the head the whole idea of the social construction of race. In other words, race is real. It's naturally, we are naturally divided into races, and then we construct in society how we interpret that. So that doesn't mean it's not a real biological difference. Genetic race is scientific truth. Social race is ideology. So then how do we explain the disadvantaged status of people of color and privileged status of whites in America if race doesn't really matter in society? Whoop. Well, I think what's coming out of some of this work, both scientific and political, is a view that we explain it by inequity. It's because of social and political differences that we see differences in status, whereas others would say it's natural. And the health disparities is one easy way of looking at it, that the reason why blacks die at higher rates from certain cancers, from heart disease, from high blood pressure, diabetes, et cetera, kidney disease, et cetera, is because we're naturally prone to those diseases. Not because of social and political conditions that make life unhealthier for various kinds of, on various levels. Well, if it's because of social and political reasons, then it's unjust. It's unjust that there are 83,000 whatever excess black deaths in 2002. If it's because of natural reasons, then it's fair. You know, there's no one to blame for it. And if it's because of unjust social and political reasons, the remedy is social change. If it's because of natural reasons, then we need an individualized remedy to cure what's wrong genetically with the person who has poorer outcomes. And those could be health outcomes, but they could also be, as Entine suggested, outcomes in the classroom as well, and in employment, and the reason why there's so many blacks in prison. You know, it becomes an explanation for lots of inequities that go on in the United States. Now, I'm just going to give one example. No, I was going to give another one. I said I should be numbered 1, but I decided I was going to go on too long. But there are, so, you know, once you start paying attention, there's so many examples in the press lately that focus on biological reasons for inequality. And just one example in The Economist last month, an article entitled "Neuroscience and Social Deprivation, I'm Just a Poor Boy, Though My Story's Seldom Told." And the article pointed to research on the effect of stress on the brain. And, but the way that the author framed it was that this is the explanation for why poverty passes from generation to generation. And it also said, you know, socialists have said it's because of social injustice, and liberals have focused on democracy, but the real reason is it has to do with the brain. And so, well, here's, oh, I thought I had skipped over it. Here's it where the author points out that almost in contrast, in other words, the implication is it's not really about democracy and opportunity and what sociologists and socialists have said. It's about this biological cause for why poor people pass on poverty to the next generation. And the article, this is the last slide in the article, the Bible says the poor will always, you will always have. Dr. Evans and Dr. Schomburg, those were the scientists who published the study, may have provided an important part of the explanation why. And so going back to Nicholas Rose's conclusion that in advanced liberal democracies, the biopolitics of identity is very different from that which characterized eugenics because it involves choice, enterprise, self-actualization, and prudence in relation to one's genetic makeup. I really think we have to question this idea that because we live in America, we could never, we don't have to be worried about the implications of linking race and genetics anymore. Because people are using these technologies to choose what they want for themselves. I think this ignores the social systems that are still in place that I think explain why black men are incarcerated at 7 times the rate of white men in this country. And I think that what this focus on race at the molecular level is doing is convincing people that this statement is true, that we don't have to worry anymore about science serving injustice because we live in a completely different era. It's just fascinating to me how people think that the world can change in a minute. You know, so it was just a couple years ago, the federal government was justifying torture, and surveys showed that many Americans thought torture was a good idea. But now, all of a sudden, a year later, we don't believe in torture. I mean, we're completely different people in this country. I would still be concerned that Americans were willing to embrace torture. And I'm still concerned that Americans were willing to embrace eugenics 50 years ago, and that we continue today to have these stark differences in life expectancy, in quality of life, in incarceration.